Hey guys, tonight we are going to drift into a story that is older than castles, older than crowns, older than the idea that history begins when Europeans start writing things down. So, dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, let your phone rest gently on the nightstand. We are going to talk about the real Native American history they don't usually teach you. Not in the loud, dramatic way, not in the epic battle soundtrack swelling in the background way, just slowly, calmly, like we are flipping through a very old, slightly dusty book that deserves better lighting. And before we begin, let's gently set aside one very common myth. Native American history did not begin in 1492 when Christopher Columbus accidentally bumped into the Caribbean, like someone who insists they meant to take that exit. No. Native American history stretches back at least 15,000 to 20,000 years, possibly more. And for most of that time, there were no European kings, no powdered wigs, no dramatic royal marriages between cousins, just entire civilizations rising, thriving, and occasionally collapsing on their own terms. So, let's float back. Long before there was a United States, before there was a New World, there were people crossing a land bridge known as Beringia. This was during the last ice age. Sea levels were lower. The space between what we now call Siberia and Alaska was walkable, which is wild to imagine. Just a casual stroll between continents. These early people did not think of themselves as Native Americans. They were simply communities, families, hunters, storytellers, people surviving an ice-filled world. Over thousands of years they spread, south into the Americas, across forests, plains, deserts, mountains. They adapted to wildly different climates, Arctic tundra, southwestern deserts, Mississippi River valleys, Pacific coast rainforests. And here's something that tends to get skipped in school textbooks. They built complex societies, not small wandering bands forever living in teepees as cartoons might suggest. Real cities, agricultural systems, trade networks that spanned thousands of miles. Let's gently drift to a place called Cahokia. Around the year 1050 CE, near what is now St. Louis, there was a city that may have had 20,000 to 40,000 people. That's bigger than London was at the same time. Yes, medieval London, the one with the mud and the plague vibes. Cahokia had massive earthen mounds. The largest, Monk's Mount, still stands. It's enormous. It required coordinated labor, planning, social organization, leaders, engineers, farmers. And yet if you went through most American schooling, you might get about one paragraph on it, if that. Because it doesn't fit the neat little narrative of empty wilderness waiting to be discovered, which to be clear, it absolutely was not. Now let's glide down to the southwest. The ancestral Puebloans, sometimes called the Anasazi, though that term has fallen out of favor, built cliff dwellings in places like Mesa Verde, multi-room structures carved into canyon walls with storage systems, irrigation techniques, astronomy knowledge. They tracked solstices. They built with intention. These were not primitive societies. They were highly adaptive cultures responding to difficult environments. They farmed corn, beans, squash, the three sisters, crops that supported dense populations. And corn, by the way, is a Native American innovation. It didn't exist in its current form before indigenous agriculturalists selectively bred it over generations. So if you've ever enjoyed popcorn at a movie, you owe a quiet thank you to Mesoamerican farmers from thousands of years ago. Let's float further south for a moment. The Maya, in what is now Mexico and Central America, developed writing systems, calendars, mathematics that included the concept of zero, monumental architecture. They charted the movements of Venus with unsettling precision. North of them, the Aztec built Tenochtitlan, a city on a lake with cannons and causeways. It was dazzling. When Hernan Cortes arrived in 1519, he described a city cleaner and more organized than many European capitals, which must have been a slightly awkward realization for him.
And yet, when we zoom back up to North America, the narrative often simplifies everything into tribes. But these were nations, confederacies, diplomatic powers. Let's gently rest for a moment with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy. Formed long before European contact, it united multiple nations: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and later Tuscarora, under a system of governance called the Great Law of Peace. It included checks and balances, representative leadership. Women had significant political authority, particularly clan mothers who selected chiefs. Some historians argue that elements of this confederacy influenced early American political thought, though that part is still debated. What is not debated is that it was sophisticated, stable, and impressively durable. Now here's where the bedtime story gently shifts, because eventually Europeans did arrive. Not just Columbus, but waves of explorers, missionaries, settlers. Spanish in the Southwest and Florida, French along the St. Lawrence and Mississippi, English along the Atlantic coast. And early contact was not immediately one long battle scene. It was trade, curiosity, alliances, misunderstandings layered on top of misunderstandings. But there was one invisible factor that would change everything: disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza. Native populations had no prior exposure to these illnesses, no built-up immunity. Mortality rates in some regions may have reached 50 to 90%. Entire communities collapsed before ever seeing a European face, just from germs traveling along trade routes. It's difficult to overstate how destabilizing that was. Imagine losing most of your extended family in a single generation. Leaders, elders, knowledge keepers, farmers, healers. Societies were weakened long before large-scale colonization even fully began. And yet, despite that, native nations adapted again. Some formed strategic alliances. The Wampanoag, for instance, initially allied with English settlers in Plymouth, because geopolitics existed here long before Europe joined the chat. The Wampanoag had rivals. European weapons and trade goods could shift balances of power. It wasn't naivete, it was calculated diplomacy in a rapidly changing world. But as English colonies expanded, land hunger grew. Treaties were signed, then ignored. Signed again, then reinterpreted. There's a recurring pattern in early American history that goes something like this: agreement, expansion, conflict, renegotiation, more expansion. Over time, indigenous nations were pushed westward, again and again and again. By the early 19th century, the United States had fully embraced the idea of manifest destiny, which is a very poetic way of saying, we would like all this land, please. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson, authorized the forced relocation of native nations east of the Mississippi River. And here we'll slow down even more, because this is where the story becomes heavy, but we'll keep our tone steady, gentle, measured. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands. Thousands died during the relocations. The Cherokee journey became known as the Trail of Tears. Families walked hundreds of miles, in winter, with limited supplies. Disease followed them. And here's one of those quiet ironies history specializes in. The Cherokee had adopted many aspects of European American society: written constitution, newspaper, farming practices, even enslaved African people. They attempted assimilation. It did not protect them, because the real issue was land. Let's gently float further west now. As settlers moved into the Great Plains, conflict intensified again. The Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Comanche, these were powerful equestrian cultures. The horse, introduced by the Spanish centuries earlier, had transformed life on the plains. Buffalo hunting supported entire economies. Spiritual systems centered on the land and the animals. Then came railroads, gold rushes, military forts. Treaties were signed guaranteeing territory. Then gold was discovered in those territories, and suddenly the treaties became flexible. The Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876 is often remembered as a dramatic showdown, but in the broader sweep of history, it was one moment in a much longer campaign of resistance and suppression. Eventually, the U.S. government shifted tactics. Boarding schools. Native children were taken from their families and sent to institutions designed to civilize them. Hair cut, languages forbidden, traditional clothing replaced, cultural practices punished. Kill the Indian, save the man, as one school founder bluntly stated. It was cultural erasure disguised as education. And yet, languages survived, stories survived, ceremonies survived, sometimes in secret, sometimes whispered, sometimes carried quietly across generations. Because Native history is not just a story of tragedy, it is also a story of survival. Today, there are hundreds of federally recognized tribes in the United States, each with its own government, culture, traditions. Contemporary Native communities are not frozen in the past. They are lawyers, artists, activists, scientists, musicians. They navigate sovereignty issues, land rights disputes, resource battles, economic development, cultural revitalization. And here's another thing that often isn't taught clearly. Native nations are not ethnic clubs. They are political entities, sovereign governments with treaty relationships to the United States. That legal distinction matters. It shapes everything from taxation to jurisdiction to water rights.
So when we talk about real Native American history, what we're really talking about is complexity. Not a single story, not a neat arc, not a bedtime fairy tale of pilgrims and friendly feasts, but thousands of years of innovation, adaptation, conflict, resilience. And if you're feeling your thoughts slow a little now, that's okay. History doesn't have to shout to be powerful. It can just sit there, steady, vast, older than the nation built on top of it. In the next stretch of our gentle journey, we'll drift into individual lives, leaders, diplomats, warriors, reformers, people who navigated impossible choices in impossible times. But for now, just let the weight of deep time settle around you. Long before there were presidents, long before there were colonies, there were nations here, and they are still here.
All right, settle back in. Maybe shift the pillow to the cool side. In part 1, we drifted through deep time. Ice bridges, cities of earth and stone, confederacies older than some European monarchies, and we left off with a quiet reminder that native nations did not disappear. They adapted. So now let's gently float into the lives of a few individuals, not as action heroes, not as tragic symbols, just as people navigating extremely complicated worlds. Because history, when you lower the volume, is often about paperwork, diplomacy, negotiations that last hours and end in misunderstandings. Let's begin with a man known to history as Tecumseh. He was born around 1768 into the Shawnee Nation in what is now Ohio. He grew up during a time when the American Revolution had just ended and the brand new United States was feeling very confident, which is usually when expansion starts looking like a hobby. Tecumseh watched as treaties were signed and signed and signed again, land ceded piece by piece, often by leaders who did not have full authority to give it away. Because native nations were not unified single blocks, they were diverse, with internal politics, rivalries, and factions. Tecumseh had an idea, a bold one. What if native nations united, not loosely, not temporarily, but permanently, a confederation across tribal lines that would refuse to cede any more land without collective agreement? It was ambitious, almost impossibly so. He traveled widely, from the Great Lakes down to the southeast, speaking, persuading, arguing that land was held in common, not owned individually by separate tribes who could sell it off like spare furniture. He was essentially building a multinational coalition in the face of a rapidly expanding republic. Of course, the United States did not love this plan. The governor of the Indiana Territory at the time was a man named William Henry Harrison. Yes, that William Henry Harrison, future president, known mostly for giving a very long inaugural speech in bad weather and then catching pneumonia, which feels almost symbolic. Harrison saw Tecumseh's Confederacy as a threat, which, to be fair, it was. A united native resistance would have slowed expansion dramatically. In 1811, while Tecumseh was away recruiting allies, U.S. forces attacked Prophetstown, the settlement led by Tecumseh's brother, Tenskwatawa. The Battle of Tippecanoe followed. It was messy, inconclusive, but symbolically important. Tecumseh later allied with the British during the War of 1812, because geopolitics again, the enemy of my enemy, is temporarily useful. When Tecumseh died in 1813 at the Battle of the Thames, the Confederacy largely unraveled, not because the idea was weak, but because sustaining unity across vast distances, cultures, and pressures is incredibly difficult. And yet, his vision remains one of the most ambitious political movements in early American history. Now let's float south for a moment, to the Cherokee Nation, and to a man named John Ross.
Ross was of mixed ancestry. His father was Scottish, his mother Cherokee. He grew up bilingual, bicultural, which positioned him uniquely in a world where treaties were written in English, but lives were rooted in Cherokee land. By the early 19th century, the Cherokee Nation had adopted a written constitution, modeled partly on the United States. They had courts, a newspaper called the Cherokee Phoenix. They had even created a syllabary, a written system for their language, developed by Sequoyah. Sequoyah's achievement alone is remarkable. A single individual developing a writing system that allowed thousands to become literate in their own language within a generation. That's the sort of innovation that usually gets more attention in world history textbooks. But back to John Ross. When gold was discovered in Georgia in the late 1820s, pressure intensified. The state of Georgia simply declared that Cherokee laws no longer applied within its borders, which is bold, legally questionable, but bold. The Cherokee took that case to the U.S. Supreme Court. In Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, the court ruled in their favor, affirming that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct political community. And here comes one of those quiet historical moments that feels important. President Andrew Jackson reportedly responded, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Whether he said those exact words is debated, but the outcome was clear. The ruling was not enforced. Removal proceeded. John Ross resisted removal through legal channels as long as he could. Another Cherokee faction, led by Major Ridge, signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, agreeing to removal. Ross argued it was illegitimate. Most Cherokee opposed it, but the U.S. government accepted it, and so the Trail of Tears unfolded. Ross himself survived the journey west. He continued leading the Cherokee Nation in what became Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. Civil war even broke out within the Cherokee community over the removal treaty. History inside history, grief layered on grief. Let's breathe for a moment. Slow inhale, slow exhale. Now we'll gently move westward again, to the plains. You may have heard of Sitting Bull. Often portrayed as a defiant warrior, and yes, he was a resistance leader, but he was also a spiritual figure, a diplomat, a strategist. He understood that the encroachment of railroads and settlers threatened not just territory, but an entire way of life centered on buffalo. After the Lakota and Cheyenne victory at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, where Lieutenant Colonel Custer was defeated, the U.S. response was relentless. Eventually, Sitting Bull fled to Canada, lived there for years, negotiated with Canadian authorities, returned to the United States under pressure when resources dwindled. In 1890, amid rising tensions surrounding the Ghost Dance religious movement, he was arrested by Indian Agency police. During the arrest, he was killed. And the narrative often reduces him to a single battle, but his life spanned decades of negotiation, adaptation, survival. Let's gently shift to someone whose story is a bit less commonly told. Wilma McEnloe.
Yes, that is her real last name. And yes, it's excellent. Born in 1945, she became the first female principal chief of the Cherokee Nation in 1985. Her childhood included relocation to California under federal policies that encouraged Native families to move to cities, promises of opportunity, often without adequate support. Later, she returned to Oklahoma, became involved in community development, focused on healthcare, education, infrastructure. Her leadership was not about resisting cavalry charges. It was about negotiating federal funding, expanding tribal enterprises, strengthening sovereignty in modern legal frameworks, which, if we're honest, requires a different kind of stamina. Because contemporary Native leadership often involves navigating federal regulations, court systems, environmental policy, and economic development, all while preserving cultural identity. And here's something that rarely gets emphasized enough. Native American history is not frozen in the 19th century. There are over 570 federally recognized tribes today in the United States, each with its own governance structure. Many operate casinos, yes, but also schools, healthcare systems, housing authorities, language revitalization programs. Tribal sovereignty is complex. It exists within U.S. federalism, sometimes upheld, sometimes challenged, always negotiated. Water rights in the West often hinge on 19th century treaties. Supreme Court cases continue to interpret those agreements. The past is not past, it is legally active. Let's drift for a moment into culture. Boarding schools attempted to suppress indigenous languages, but today many tribes run immersion schools to revitalize them. Elders teach children words nearly lost. Songs return. Powwows are not tourist attractions. They are living gatherings, ceremonial, social, intertribal. Art flourishes, literature flourishes. Writers like Louise Erdrich weave contemporary Native life into award-winning novels, blending humor, sorrow, resilience.
So when someone says they don't teach you the real Native American history, it's not always about hidden conspiracy. Sometimes it's about simplification. Textbooks compress thousands of nations into a few chapters, reduce centuries into bullet points. But the real story is expansive. It's cities before Columbus, diplomacy before independence, resistance and adaptation intertwined, legal battles that continue into the 21st century. And through it all, continuity. Families, communities, governments, languages. Still here. Still negotiating. Still evolving. Let your mind drift gently over that idea. History is not just what ended. It's what endured. In the next part, we'll float into cultural survival, the quiet rebellions of language, ceremony, and identity that persisted even under pressure to disappear. For now, just rest in the steady rhythm of it all. The story continues.
All right. Let's settle in again. Maybe the room is darker now. Maybe the world outside is quieter. In the last stretch of our slow historical wandering, we left off with leaders and diplomats, people who navigated removal, war, and reinvention. Now we're going to drift into something less dramatic, but perhaps even more persistent: survival. Not the cinematic kind, the paperwork kind, the language at the kitchen table kind. Because the 20th century did not suddenly solve everything, it simply changed the method. By the late 1800s, the United States had largely confined native nations to reservations. The open warfare period had mostly ended. The cavalry photos were taken. The frontier was declared closed. Which sounds tidy. It was not tidy. In 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act. Officially, it was about allotment. The idea was to divide communal tribal lands into individual parcels. Each native household would receive a plot. The rest, the surplus, would be open to non-native settlement. It was framed as a path to assimilation, private property, farming, citizenship. It also resulted in the loss of millions of acres of tribal land. Communal landholding had been a foundation of many native societies. Allotment fractured that. Over time, land became fractionated among heirs. Some parcels were lost entirely. And yet, people adapted again. Ceremonies that had been banned were practiced quietly, sometimes in secret, sometimes reinterpreted to survive under federal scrutiny. Languages were spoken softly at home, even when children were punished for using them at school. Boarding schools continued into the early 20th century, children sent far from family, given English names, trained for manual labor or domestic service. The goal was assimilation, complete and irreversible, but cultural memory is stubborn. Let's float to the 1930s. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 marked a shift in federal policy. It ended allotment, encouraged tribes to form self-governing constitutions, attempted, imperfectly, to restore some measure of sovereignty. It wasn't universally embraced. Some tribes adopted the new framework, others resisted. The idea of imposing standardized constitutional models on diverse nations had its own complications. Still, it represented a pause in the land loss machine. Then came World War II. Thousands of Native Americans served in the U.S. military. Among them were the Navajo code talkers, using the Dene language as a basis for an unbreakable code in the Pacific Theater. Their language, once suppressed in schools, became a strategic asset. There's a quiet irony there. A government that once punished children for speaking their language later relied on that language for wartime communication. History enjoys those circular moments. After the war, federal policy shifted again, this time toward termination. In the 1950s, the U.S. government sought to terminate the federal recognition of certain tribes, end treaty relationships, dissolve reservations, encourage relocation to urban centers. It was presented as modernization, integration, efficiency. It often meant loss of land, services, and legal recognition. Relocation programs encouraged Native families to move to cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, Denver. Promises of jobs and housing were sometimes over-optimistic, and so urban Native communities formed. Intertribal networks grew, cultural exchange intensified. Powwows expanded beyond reservation boundaries. Identity adapted to city life. Let's pause here, because this is one of those things rarely emphasized in school. Native America is not only rural or reservation-based, it is urban, suburban, everywhere.
Now we gently drift into the late 1960s and 1970s, the era of civil rights, protest, reassessment. In 1969, Native activists occupied Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. The occupation lasted 19 months. It drew national attention to treaty rights and broken promises. The activists pointed out that unused federal land should, by treaty logic, revert to Native control. It was symbolic, strategic, media-savvy, and it marked a turning point in public awareness. Soon after, organizations like the American Indian Movement emerged. Protests at Wounded Knee in 1973 brought renewed attention to sovereignty issues. Now, we're not going to turn this into an action montage. Instead, imagine meetings in community centers, long discussions about legal strategy, about treaty interpretation, about cultural revival. Because the 1970s also saw the passage of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act in 1975. This allowed tribes to contract with the federal government to administer programs themselves. Education, healthcare, social services. Gradually, control began shifting back toward tribal governance. Slowly, incrementally, never with complications. Meanwhile, cultural revitalization deepened. Languages once in danger were documented, taught, recorded. Elders worked with linguists, dictionaries compiled, immersion schools founded. Powwows grew larger, intertribal gatherings blended tradition and contemporary expression. Art flourished, beadwork evolved, contemporary native painters and sculptors gained national recognition. Literature expanded beyond anthropological curiosity and into mainstream publishing. Authors told stories that were not confined to pre-contact life or tragic endings. Stories about modern love, urban life, humor, bureaucratic absurdities.
Because native life includes bureaucracy and jokes about bureaucracy. Let's gently consider sovereignty in the modern era. Tribal courts operate within reservations, tribal police, tribal colleges, economic enterprises ranging from agriculture to renewable energy. Yes, gaming operations are part of the story for some tribes. The Indian Gaming Regulatory Act of 1988 provided a legal framework for casinos on tribal land. But casinos are not universal, and they are not the totality of economic development. Some tribes focus on tourism, others on energy production, others on manufacturing or technology. All within a complicated legal landscape where federal, state, and tribal jurisdictions overlap like an overenthusiastic Venn diagram. Supreme Court cases continue to shape this landscape. In 2020, the court ruled in McGirt v. Oklahoma that much of eastern Oklahoma remains legally recognized as Muskogee Creek Nation reservation land for purposes of federal criminal law. The ruling hinged on treaty interpretation from the 19th century, which means decisions made generations ago still echo through courtrooms today. History is not a closed book. It is active litigation. Let's slow that thought down. Treaties signed in the 1800s still matter. Words written with ink and quill continue to define jurisdiction in 2020's America. That is not ancient history, that is current affairs. Now, as we gently approach the present, let's talk about identity. Being Native American today is not a costume, not a single look, not a stereotype from a Western film. It is enrolled citizenship in a sovereign nation. It is community recognition. It is family lineage. It is cultural participation. It is also navigating misconceptions. The idea that Native Americans vanished, the idea that they exist only in the past tense, the idea that history ended at Wounded Knee. It did not end. It transformed. Universities now have Native studies programs. Museums collaborate with tribes to repatriate cultural artifacts under laws like the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Sacred items are returned. Ancestors reburied. It is slow, sometimes painfully so. But it is movement. And throughout all of this, there is something steady. Storytelling. Oral histories carried forward. Now sometimes recorded. Sometimes written, sometimes adapted into film or poetry. Because survival is not just physical endurance. It is narrative continuity. It is the refusal to let the story be told only by someone else. So when we say the real Native American history they don't teach you, perhaps what we mean is this.
The story did not begin with colonization, it did not end with conquest, and it is not confined to tragedy. It includes innovation, governance, diplomacy, loss, adaptation, humor, court cases, language apps, environmental activism, science degrees, community gardens. It is layered, complicated, still unfolding. Let your breathing slow. Imagine the long arc from Beringia to the present day, from Ice Age migrations to Supreme Court rulings, from earthen mounds to urban council meetings. All of it connected, all of it human. In the next and final stretch of our journey, we'll gently weave these threads together, not with a dramatic conclusion, just with perspective. For now, just rest in the continuity. They were here. They adapted. They remain.
If you've made it this far, you're either very relaxed or you fell asleep somewhere around the Dawes Act and just woke up again. Either way, we're continuing gently. No dramatic finale, no swelling music. Just a slow drift across centuries. We've talked about cities before Columbus, confederacies with constitutional frameworks, diplomats who tried to outmaneuver expansion, children sent to boarding schools, court cases still shaping the present. Now let's just sit with the big picture. One of the quiet distortions in mainstream history is the idea that Native American history is mostly about disappearance, a long fade out. But if you look closely, it's more like adaptation layered over endurance. Let's float back briefly to something steady. Land. For many indigenous nations, land is not just property. It's relationship, responsibility, sacred geography, rivers with stories, mountains with memory. When treaties were signed in the 18th and 19th centuries, they were often understood very differently by each side. U.S. officials thought in terms of permanent transfer of ownership. Many Native leaders understood land as shared use, negotiated space, stewardship. Two worldviews using the same paper, meaning very different things. And those mismatched understandings ripple forward. Today, tribes across the United States are deeply involved in environmental protection. Water rights battles in the Southwest, salmon restoration in the Pacific Northwest, pipeline protests in the Northern Plains. These are not new conflicts, they're extensions of older ones. When you hear about land acknowledgements at universities or museums, those are small gestures toward recognizing whose land institutions occupy. Symbolic, yes. But symbols can matter. And here's something else that often gets skipped in textbooks. Native nations were never monolithic. There were alliances with Europeans, there were conflicts between tribes, there were strategic marriages, trade agreements, rivalries that predated colonization by centuries. History is rarely a simple good versus evil narrative. It's people making choices with limited information under immense pressure. Let's gently drift into modern cultural life. Native film festivals now showcase Indigenous directors telling stories from their own perspectives. Musicians blend traditional drumming with hip-hop and electronic sounds. Fashion designers incorporate beadwork into contemporary runways.
This is not cultural loss. It's evolution. Languages once nearly silenced are being taught through apps and immersion schools. Children laugh at words their great-grandparents were punished for speaking. That quiet comeback is powerful in a way that doesn't need fireworks. And politically, tribal sovereignty continues to evolve. Tribal courts assert jurisdiction in ways that were once denied. Federal law recognizes certain treaty obligations. Supreme Court decisions reaffirm and sometimes restrict those rights. It's a constant negotiation. Not static. Not settled. Let's zoom out even further. For over 10,000 years, indigenous peoples shaped the ecosystems of North America. Controlled burns maintained forest health. Agricultural techniques increased biodiversity. River systems were managed with long-term sustainability in mind. Modern environmental science is increasingly acknowledging what native communities have long practiced: stewardship over extraction.
Which makes the historical irony even heavier. Communities once dismissed as uncivilized are now cited in sustainability research. Time has a sense of humor, a very dry one. Now, let's gently revisit something we mentioned earlier, the myth of emptiness. When Europeans arrived, they encountered landscapes already shaped by human hands, fields cultivated, trade routes established, political alliances formed. The idea of an untouched wilderness was, in many cases, a misunderstanding, sometimes convenient. Because it's easier to claim land that seems empty, harder to admit it belongs to complex societies with laws and histories of their own. And yet, even after centuries of displacement, those societies remain. There are over 570 federally recognized tribes in the United States today, many more state-recognized, each with its own government, its own story, its own future. Some reservations struggle economically, others operate thriving enterprises. Some communities are small and rural, others are deeply urban and interconnected. There is no single Native American experience, just as there is no single American experience. Now let's slow this even more. Imagine standing in one place, anywhere in North America. A city street, a cornfield, a desert canyon. Beneath your feet are layers of history, not metaphorically, literally. Ancient trade paths, forgotten village sites, ceremonial grounds, family homelands. History doesn't vanish, it accumulates. The real history is not hidden in secret archives. It's often just condensed, simplified, trimmed to fit classroom schedules. But if you stretch it back out, if you let it breathe, you see a continuity that refuses to disappear. And maybe that's the quietest lesson of all. Empires rise, expand, rename rivers, redraw borders. But people remember. They pass down stories, recipes, songs, clan affiliations, place names that predate English and Spanish and French.
memory becomes resistance. Culture becomes continuity. So as we gently close this long, slow journey, let's avoid a dramatic ending. No tragic crescendo. No triumphant anthem. Just perspective. Native American history is not a prologue to American history. It is American history. And older. It is governance systems that predate the Constitution. Agricultural knowledge that reshaped global diets. Legal agreements that still shape Supreme Court rulings. Languages spoken softly, then loudly again. It is survival without spectacle. And if you're feeling your thoughts soften now, that's okay. History, when told slowly, feels less like a battlefield and more like a river. It moves. It bends. It carries memory forward. Long before 1492. Long after removal. Long into the present.